It was a typical Saturday morning when Greg came home early from work. He had been staying late at the office all week, and today he decided to surprise his wife, Sarah. She had always been supportive, taking care of the house while Greg focused on his career. They had been married for 7 years, but over the past few months, Greg had noticed that Sarah seemed distant, her eyes no longer shining with the same warmth they once had. The house was quiet when Greg entered. There were no sounds of the TV or Sarah humming in the kitchen. It was strange. He called her name but received no response. Confused, he walked through the house and headed toward the kitchen. He froze at the door when he saw her standing at the counter, holding a plate with something that looked oddly familiar. On the plate was the remains of his beloved dog. Max. The dog, a loyal German shepherd, had been with Greg since the early days of his marriage to Sarah. He had always referred to Max as part of the family, and they shared a special bond. But now, Sarah was eating what was left of him, chewing slowly, seemingly unaware that Greg had walked in. "Sarah, what? What are you doing?" Greg shouted, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. Sarah dropped the fork she was holding and turned slowly. Her face was pale, but there was no sign of guilt. She simply looked at Greg, as though the situation was nothing unusual. "I'm sorry, Greg. I didn't mean for you to find out like this," Sarah said quietly, her voice distant, almost cold. "But Max, he had to go." Greg's mind raced. He couldn't understand what he was hearing. His thoughts were spinning, and the anger built up inside him. His dog, the creature that had been his companion, now reduced to nothing but a meal in front of him. And Sarah, his wife, the woman he loved, had been the one to do this. It didn't make sense. "Why? Why would you do this?" Greg asked, his voice trembling. Sarah didn't respond right away. Instead, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and then took a deep breath. "I've been feeling empty, Greg. I don't know how to explain it. I needed to feel something." Max. Well, he was just there. Greg's heart sank. The betrayal was not just in the act of eating his dog, it was in the fact that Sarah had distanced herself from him, emotionally and physically, so much that she had resorted to something this grotesque. Greg felt a mixture of disgust, confusion, and heartbreak. It wasn't just the dog. It was everything, the trust, the bond, everything they had built together. But in that moment, something inside him snapped. The anger he had been suppressing for months, for years, came rushing to the surface. The thoughts about Sarah's coldness, the countless hours he had spent working, the emotional distance between them, it all came together in a single, devastating realization. "You're not the woman I married," Greg muttered under his breath. His eyes were now wild with rage. The gun, which he kept in a drawer in the kitchen for protection, suddenly seemed so close, so easy to grab. Before Sarah could speak again, Greg stormed towards the drawer. His hand gripped the cold steel of the gun as if it were the only thing that could give him the clarity he needed. Sarah's eyes widened as she took a step back, realizing too late the danger she was now in. "Greg, please," she whispered. But her voice was drowned out by the sound of the gunshot. The bullet pierced Sarah's chest before she could make another move. She collapsed to the floor, her eyes wide in shock, a single tear escaping down her cheek. Greg stood there, breathing heavily, the gun still raised. He didn't know what he felt anymore, guilt, regret, or relief. But he couldn't take back what he had just done. The house that once felt like a home now felt like a tomb. And all Greg could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears, louder than anything else. The world felt like it was moving in slow motion. Greg stood over Sarah's lifeless body, the gun still in his trembling hands. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The silence that followed the gunshot was deafening. It was as though the air itself had thickened, making it hard to breathe. Greg's thoughts were scattered, chaotic, and disconnected from reality. He looked at Sarah's face, her eyes wide open in a final expression of disbelief. How could she have let things get so far? How had their relationship deteriorated to this point? Was it all his fault? He had been so absorbed in his work, so focused on climbing the corporate ladder. He had neglected her, neglected their marriage, and now this. The once warm home they had shared now felt cold and foreign. The taste of guilt and regret hit him hard. But there was something else, something darker, bubbling beneath the surface. A strange numbness crept through him. The weight of what he had just done felt distant, as if it hadn't fully sunk in yet. In a daze, Greg stumbled back to the kitchen, his eyes scanning the room like a man in a fog. He looked at the remnants of Max on the counter, the dog's half-eaten flesh still on the plate. The sight made his stomach churn, but he didn't look away. He needed to understand what had just happened. The events of the last few hours felt surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. His mind raced back to the conversations he and Sarah had had over the last few months. She had been different, distant, withdrawn, almost like she was living in another world. He had tried to ask her what was wrong, but she always brushed him off. Was it because of his neglect? Was she acting out because of the distance that had crept into their marriage? Greg's thoughts spiraled as the realization hit him with full force. He had been so focused on his career, so wrapped up in his own world, that he hadn't seen what was happening to her, to them. She had felt so alone that she resorted to something as bizarre as eating their dog. The betrayal, the way she had thrown their bond away, was too much for him to process. And yet, in that moment, he had decided that he was done. Done with the lies, the distance, the pain. The sight of the gun in his hand brought him back to reality. He couldn't leave the scene. He couldn't just walk away from this. The guilt would eat him alive. But the thought of getting caught made his heart race even faster. He needed to think, to make sure he didn't get caught. Greg quickly began to clean up the mess. His hands were shaking as he placed the gun back in the drawer and wiped away any trace of his involvement in Sarah's death. He didn't know what to do next. The police would be here soon, and the evidence would be clear. He had killed her. He had shot his wife, the woman he once loved, for something as absurd as eating their dog. But as he cleaned the blood from the floor and tried to calm his racing heart, one thing became clear: he had to get away. He couldn't face the consequences. He couldn't let anyone know what had happened here today. With trembling hands, he grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and started packing. Clothes, money, his passport, anything he could grab in a hurry. He knew it wouldn't be long before someone noticed Sarah was missing, and by then, he would be long gone. The thought of fleeing to another city, starting fresh, seemed like his only option. He couldn't live with the weight of this crime, but he also couldn't stay. There was no going back. As Greg prepared to leave, a thought gnawed at him. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But then again, it had. His life had spiraled out of control, and now he was left with nothing but a shattered home and a dead wife. And as he stepped out the door, the sound of sirens in the distance echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a chilling reminder that the past would catch up with him eventually. The morning after Greg fled, the police arrived at the house. A neighbor had reported hearing a gunshot, followed by strange quiet. When they couldn't reach Sarah, they decided to check on her. They never expected what they found. Detective Linda Marks walked through the front door, her eyes scanning the room with a sharp focus. She had seen many crime scenes in her career, but this one felt different. The bloodstains on the floor were stark against the polished wood. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. And then, there was Sarah, lying lifeless in the kitchen, her eyes wide open in shock, the look of betrayal still frozen on her face. Jesus. Detective Marks muttered, her hand instinctively reaching for her notepad. What the hell happened here? Her partner, Detective Jason Davis, was already by Sarah's body, examining the wound. The shot had been fatal, right through the chest, point blank. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, and it didn't look like a random shooting. No, this was personal. No signs of forced entry, Davis noted, his voice steady. Looks like she knew her killer. No struggle either. Marks nodded, noting down the details. Any idea where the husband is? Davis stood up, glancing around. No sign of Greg. It's like he vanished. But look at this. He knelt down to examine the counter, where remnants of a half-eaten meal lay. Is that dog? Marks leaned in for a closer look, her stomach turning. It's Max, she said, recalling the dog Greg had always spoken so fondly of. That's strange. Why would she? Look at the gun, Davis interrupted. It's clean. No fingerprints. Whoever did this must have known what they were doing. Let's start with Greg, then, Marks said, closing her notepad. He's the obvious suspect. The wife's dead, and he's nowhere to be found. The detectives got to work, canvassing the neighborhood and asking anyone who might have seen something. They learned that Greg had been working long hours at a local tech firm, but no one had seen him for the past 2 days. His car was gone, and there was no record of his whereabouts after the shooting. Marks didn't need to ask twice. She called the tech company to confirm Greg's whereabouts. They reported that Greg had left work early the previous day and hadn't returned. His absence was odd, especially considering how dedicated he had been to his job in the past. But it wasn't just his absence that was troubling. It was the mystery of why Sarah had eaten Max. There were no signs of a fight or anything that seemed to explain the act. Had Sarah gone mad? Had she snapped from some deep-seated emotional strain? Or was there something more, something Greg didn't want to admit? The more Marks thought about it, the more questions piled up, and the more Greg's disappearance seemed like a confession in itself. Hours later, Marks and Davis sat in their car outside, a small diner where Greg used to go for lunch. They had gotten a tip that he might be here, or at least that someone might have seen him. As they sat in the car, Marks stared out the window, her mind whirling. The more she thought about it, the more she believed that this wasn't a simple case of infidelity gone wrong. This felt like something darker, something that had been building for months. "I think we're looking at a man who's been living in his own lie," Marks said, turning to Davis. "A man who ignored everything around him. And when his world came crashing down, he reacted violently." Davis agreed. "Yeah, it seems like a classic case of emotional buildup. He couldn't handle whatever happened with Sarah. And when she did, what she did with the dog, it pushed him over the edge." They watched the diner entrance for a few more minutes before seeing someone who looked familiar walk past Greg. He wasn't looking at them, but Marks recognized him instantly. Her heart skipped a beat. They had found him. They followed him to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The room was dim, and the door was cracked open. Greg sat on the edge of the bed, his hands covering his face, as though he were trying to block out the world. Marks knocked lightly on the door. "Greg Palmer," she called softly, though the words were firm. Greg froze, his whole body tensing. He didn't turn around, but he knew. He knew what was coming. "Greg," Marks repeated, her voice more commanding this time. "We need to talk." Greg turned around slowly, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He knew this moment had come, and now he was face to face with the consequences of his actions. "I didn't mean to," Greg muttered, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. But she ate Max, detective. She ate my dog. You don't understand." She was distant, cold, and then she did that. I didn't know what to do anymore. Marks didn't say anything. She just watched him, taking in every word he said, weighing each one carefully. She could tell he was a man unraveling, a man who had reached his breaking point. "Greg," she said finally, her voice softening just a bit. "It's too late for apologies now. You took her life. You took your wife's life over something you didn't even understand. And now, we have to face the truth." Tears welled in Greg's eyes. "I never meant for it to end this way. I loved her. I thought I could fix everything. But it was too late." The detectives arrested him right there. It was over. Greg Palmer's life, and the life he had once built, had been destroyed by his own hands. The case wasn't just about a crime. It was a story of a broken marriage, infidelity, and betrayal that had culminated in the unthinkable. As they drove Greg back to the station, Mark sat in silence. She knew there were no simple answers, no easy way to explain the pain and destruction that had unfolded. In the end, all that remained were the shattered pieces of a life lost, of a man who had gone too far, pushed by his own bitterness and confusion, to understand the damage he had caused until it was too late.